Now to the horror that is Gaza. For more than 10 months, Israel has been carrying out airstrikes and ground attacks in Gaza following the Hamas raid of the 7th of October. 1,200 people died in the massacre in southern Israel, while Hamas took 251 hostages. Since then, more than 40,000 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, according to the Hamas-run health ministry. Israel disputes those figures, but says around a third of that number have been killed as fighters, while it has lost 300 soldiers. So what are the prospects for a ceasefire in Gaza? Well, Israeli and US security officials are holding negotiations in Qatar, but Hamas is not taking part. It accuses Israel of adding new conditions to an earlier American proposal, something Israel denies. Well, for his assessment, I'm joined now on the line by the Israeli ambassador to Nigeria, Michael Freeman. Mr. Freeman, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Let me begin by asking you the question that we posed just a minute ago. If Hamas aren't taking part in the talks, what's the point of holding these negotiations?
Well, good evening, Charles. It's always a pleasure to be here. Look, it's a good question. We are hopeful that whilst Hamas might not be in the room, they're in Doha, they're in Qatar. That's where much of their leadership is based. And they are certainly being updated on the proposals and on the conversations that are taking place. And we are very much hopeful that Hamas will accept a ceasefire and will allow us to release the hostages and to move forward.
Hamas say they are protesting against what they say are new conditions added to the existing proposals by your Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Is there any merit in those allegations? If so, what might these new conditions be?
No, there's no justification. There's no truth in that. And again, the original proposal here that was outlined by President Biden was in fact Prime Minister Netanyahu's outline. It was an Israeli outline. It's an Israeli proposal for the peace, for the moving forward in the ceasefire. So we've certainly got no incentive to change that because it's our initial proposal that we've put forward. If anyone's trying to change it, it's Hamas. You know, the first stage of this proposal calls for the release of 33 Israeli hostages. Hamas have now said, well, they don't necessarily want to release live people. They'd like to release a number of dead bodies. And that's clearly ridiculous. If you're going to release hostages, then we want the elderly, we want the women, we want the injured, we want the children that they're holding to be released in the first stage. So that's what we're asking for. And Hamas are the ones at the moment resolutely refusing to stand by that.
And of course, Ambassador, one of the unknowables is the fact that the political leader of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh, was assassinated in Tehran a couple of weeks ago. He's been replaced by Yahya Sinwar, who is based inside Gaza and is known to be a much more hardline figure. Are you any clearer as to what impact that change on leadership might have on the talks?
Well, I think, first of all, we need to dispel this myth about a hardline leader and a not hardline leader. Ismail Haniyeh, on the 7th of October, publicly and openly was expressing joy for what was taking place inside Israel, was on TV congratulating and praying and thanking the Hamas forces, the Hamas terrorists who'd invaded Israel, and as you said in your program, were murdering, raping, terrorizing and killing Israelis. So Ismail Haniyeh was certainly no moderate, was certainly no one who was contributing. This was an international terrorist who had the blood of thousands of Israelis and thousands of non-Israelis on his hand. He was an evil person that the world will not miss. As for Yahya Sinwar, he is also a terrorist. He is the person who commanded the forces. He's the person who commanded the terrorists that came into Israel. He is the man who's been hiding in the tunnels for 10 months. He's the man who's underground and is there. And at this point, the question is, are Hamas willing to have a ceasefire? We've been very clear that we are willing. We want to bring our people home. We have 115 people being held as hostages inside Gaza, including a 1-year-old baby, including a 5-year-old boy, an 86-year-old man, dozens of injured women. It's really, we want to bring them home. And so we've made these proposals, and we hope that Hamas will accept it.
And Ambassador, on the Israeli side, its delegation is now known to be divided. I mean, it's out in the open, and we're hearing that it's almost a mutiny within the Israeli armed forces, who are saying that the time has come to do a deal and that they've done what they can militarily. So the big question is whether Prime Minister Netanyahu, in the face of that unprecedented pressure from his own military as well as Israel's main ally, the US, is ready to make a deal.
Well, Prime Minister Netanyahu has been very clear all the way that he wants a deal, that he wants to have to bring the hostages home, that we want to have a ceasefire enabled in order to be able to do that. It's Hamas who've rejected that over and over and over again. Nothing would make us happier than to have a ceasefire and bring our people home. We want to do that. And, all of those people around the world who have been calling for a ceasefire and calling for a pause or for some sort of stop in the war and the conflict in Gaza need to be on the streets now calling on Hamas to accept this ceasefire. The American president, the Americans and others have been very clear that Israel has put this proposal forward. We're the ones who've said we want this, and it's Hamas who are the ones who are now doing this. And you're showing on your screens these pictures of Israelis who are demonstrating and saying they want a ceasefire. My question would be: where are the Palestinians? Where are the other people pressing Hamas for a ceasefire? Where are the people calling on Hamas for a ceasefire? Because ultimately, it's in their hands. If Hamas tomorrow say yes, we accept, yes, we agree, then we will have a ceasefire.
Well, I mean, some would argue that it's impossible for the Palestinians to come together in Gaza to hold the kind of demonstrations we saw on the screen, because you've bombed them to submission. But do you expect that this will be a very tricky set of talks, even though the US and others are pushing really hard to get this deal past the post, as it were?
Look, it's definitely going to be difficult. It's going to be very complicated. We know who Hamas are. Hamas are a radical, extremist terror organization whose aims and goals are the destruction of the state of Israel and the killing of all the Jews around the world. And when you're having negotiations with an organization like that, it's always difficult. It's always tricky, and you can never really trust their word. Who says that even if they agree tomorrow, that they'll stick by their word? Because, we have to remember that on the 6th of October, there was a ceasefire with Gaza. There was a total ceasefire. There was nothing happening. Everything was calm on the border. And it was Hamas who breached that ceasefire by coming into Israel and murdering 1,200 Israelis. So we have to remember where this came from, and that we can't necessarily trust anything that Hamas say. This is a radical, extremist, genocidal terror organization that you can't trust anything they say.
Meanwhile, of course, the Hamas-run health ministry in Gaza says the number of Palestinians killed during Israel's military campaign has risen to more than 40,000. It says more than 92,000 have been wounded since the conflict began last October. And they say the figure is verifiable because each of the more than 40,000 names are accompanied by a photo of the person who was killed and an ID number. Given that, do you dispute those figures?
Firstly, I absolutely dispute those figures. Hamas are known to lie, and terror organization that's willing to rape, murder, burn alive, and torture and kidnap is obviously also willing to lie. But we need to, even on the first example of that, of those 40,000, Hamas seemed to not say that any of their terrorists or any of their fighters were killed, which is clearly preposterous. The Israeli army today released statistics that said, we believe a minimum of 17,000 Hamas terrorists have been killed. We believe the number is higher than that, but we've got verifiable information on 17,000 that have been killed. We believe the number is probably over 20,000. So even if we took the Hamas figures, which again, I want to be very clear, I'm very skeptical of, and I don't believe them. Even if we took them, it would mean that we were looking at a ratio of 1-to-1 or less than 1-to-1 of combatants to civilians. And obviously, that's a tragedy. The death of any innocent civilian is an absolute tragedy. But if we look at modern warfare, modern urban warfare in particular, if we look at Mosul, if we look at Afghanistan, if we look at all of these places, traditional urban warfare, the figure has been one combatant or one terrorist to 3 to 4 innocent civilians. And in this instance, even the Hamas ministry are claiming a 1-to-1 ratio, which would be the lowest ratio in the history of urban warfare. So, the death of any innocent is a terrible, terrible tragedy. And I don't want to see any suffering on behalf of the Palestinians. I don't want to see any Palestinians suffering. I don't want to see any Israelis suffering, because that's not going to help anybody. But ultimately, this is the fault of Hamas. It's Hamas that started this. It's Hamas that are hiding behind civilian populations, that are holding their control and command centers in school, in mosques and underground. And the quicker that Hamas can surrender, that Hamas can release the hostages, the quicker this can be over with.
Meanwhile, Ambassador, I understand as the days go by, people in Israel are more and more concerned about an attack from Iran and its proxies, and there are predictions from the Israeli media that it'll come any day now. I mean, we keep hearing from the Israelis that they don't have an appetite for a wider conflict. But I mean, taking out the leader of Hamas in Iran and a senior Hezbollah commander in Lebanon, I mean, these are not the actions of someone who wants de-escalation, are they?
Well, I think we need to put into context the Israelis killed Fuad Shukr, who is an arch terrorist in Lebanon of Hezbollah, and that came the day after, a couple of days after, that Hezbollah killed 12 children playing football, 12 Druze Arab children who were playing football on a football pitch on a Saturday afternoon, and a Hezbollah rocket landed on their football pitch and killed 12 of them. And so Israel decided that we would respond to that we wouldn't allow that to happen. And I would remind you that on October the 7th, there was a ceasefire on the northern border. Hezbollah started firing rockets on October the 8th for absolutely no reason. There is no dispute between Israel and Hezbollah on the northern border. Israel and Lebanon have got a border that's been agreed by the United Nations, that's been demarcated, and that has been agreed. So it's absolutely outrageous that Hezbollah would fire. On the Saturday, they killed 12 children. And so Israel, in a very careful, targeted attack, took out the man responsible for that attack on those 12 children, a man with over 40 years of terrorist history, who was wanted by the Americans for killing 280 Marines and others in the 1983 bombing in Lebanon. This was an arch terrorist, and it was done as a direct response to the killing of 12 children. As for Iran, I would say to Iran, do not launch an attack on Israel. Ismail Haniyeh was killed in Tehran. Israel has not taken responsibility. Israel has not been involved, has not admitted any responsibility or involvement in that whatsoever. But I would say this, that when Osama bin Laden was killed inside Pakistan, no one said, Pakistan should attack America now. Of course not. The world celebrated the death of a master terrorist, of an evil man, and said, if anything, the country should be thanking us for taking out bin Laden, who was a terrorist. So I would say the Iranians should not attack Israel. There is no reason to attack Israel. And if they do so, Israel will defend ourselves and we will respond in an appropriate way. We do not want war. We do not want to have an escalation. But at the same time, if we are attacked, we will respond and we will defend our people and we will defend our country.
On that note, I want to thank you very much indeed, Ambassador Michael Freeman, for taking the time to talk to us. We always appreciate your contribution. Michael Freeman is the Israeli ambassador to Nigeria, and he was talking to me on the line there from Abuja. That's it for this edition of Arise Prime Time. Join us again tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja, bye-bye and thank you for watching.